a good 4 minutes for people to join. And I think we'll just get started. And then as people trickle in, they'll just pick up from wherever we are. So first of all, thank you so much for taking the time today, Mohit, Anand, Greg, calling in middle of the day, middle of the night, wherever you're based out of. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And I have a set of questions, but would love to kind of just get started with an off the beat kind of question to say, y'all are obviously very decorated and very talented entrepreneurs. You could have started a business in any space. I can think of cool spaces that you could have done gaming, you could have done something in social media, but all three of y'all chose shared mobility. So would love to kind of go around the table to understand, and maybe we can do it in the order of Mohit, Anand, and Greg as you're appearing on my Zoom, to just talk about why shared mobility, how does it appeal to you, and what attracted you to the space.
Yeah, I spent more than a decade, in Karwale, in some way helping people go from point A to point B. And it was very obvious that as human beings, right, we have solved inter-country, inter-city, but we have not solved the daily commute. And less than 3% people in India can afford a cab, right, or a car for that matter, right? So very low number. And it was very obvious that car ownership is getting disrupted. And you can look at, a Zoomcar, and people don't have to buy a car to go from A to B, etc. It was so obvious. And therefore, so one was very clear that daily commute is the one category unsolved. But the big reason for me to pick that was business should be built around where people have a blind spot, where other people can't really see, right? Some truth that nobody really believes in, right? As Peter Thiel said it. And I can just see that people don't really realize that, buses are the largest TAM in this country. $20 billion is what people spend in bus ticketing every year. And they're run by small private operators. None of us would really, see that. We live in Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, and we think buses are run by the government. The reality is that 75% of the buses are run by very, very small operators who own one or two buses. So it was like such a big market, completely fragmented, and the fact that you're not solved the daily commute in this country, right? Or for that matter, anywhere else actually. In New York, right? Greg is there. Even there, the daily commute is not solved. You have so much congestion, pollution, and so on and so forth, right? So last time, very clear blind spot of other people, and you want to build a business, something like that.
Got it. Nilesh? Okay. So for me, I think, so the answer for whether not social or gaming was actually fairly easy. I spent like 3-4 years in Flipkart before my Vogo days, right? And it was very clear to me that I enjoyed personally building businesses which are offline, operations heavy, where you actually see transactions happening and goods flowing from point A to point B, right? And like Mohit said, mobility is one of those very fundamental unsolved problems, especially intra-city transport kind of play, right? The way I sort of thought of it was everybody was building, and this is where I think the insight is important, right? Everybody was building solutions which are around how do you take a driver and put him on top of a vehicle and then use that to transport either 1 or 2 or 3 people from point A to point B, right? And in most of these assets, the driver is actually costlier than the monthly cost of the vehicle itself, right? If it's a bike taxi, then the driver is 15 to 20,000 bucks. Probably the rental of that vehicle or the EMI the guy pays on the vehicle is 2,000, 2,500 bucks, right? It's similar for a cab where the EMI and the driver cost are similar, right? So the idea was, how do you take the driver out of the equation and actually use that asset to move from point A to point B directly? Can the customer drive the vehicle himself? People who own vehicles have a very, very underutilized asset, right? Whether it's a car or whether it's a scooter, the insight which led to Zoomcar and the insight which led to Vogo, is that people are using a vehicle for 1 hour a day. They're using it maybe for maybe 10, 15 kilometers a day, right? If the same vehicle is utilized by more people every day, that's where the magic happens, where 4 or 5 people are using the asset, you have an extremely underutilized asset, and you're taking the most expensive part of private transport, which is the driver, out of the equation. So that's broadly where the idea of Vogo came.
Got it. So yeah, thanks guys. So just a little bit on my side. So yeah, I think for me, somewhat similar, but then a little bit distinct, I would say, because prior to starting Zoomcar, I was of course working in the US, and my background was actually in finance and investment banking and private equity, but my focus was always within sustainability and renewable energy and clean tech infra. So for me, it was always about the environmental problem statements because it was something which was so acute in really every city across the globe. And I think growing up in New York, I obviously saw it firsthand. But then when I started to travel a lot, especially into emerging markets, I saw that problem was even more acute in terms of the city-based pollution. that came from heavy congestion, that came from dirty coal or any other non-renewable power source. But I think that for me, transportation was something that could be disrupted more easily through software and through sort of social network effects. And it was a business that would not require significant government investment in terms of infrastructure or permits or approvals. So I think that was something which made transportation and mobility much more exciting and sort of enthralling to go after. And this was all the way back in 2013. So it's really that sort of triple bottom line mission statement, which kind of fueled us.
Awesome. And I think the common theme that we've kind of seen throughout the three, right, is that there's elements of like an operational kind of heaviness in the business in a sense. There's technology, which is kind of that lever, right? And this is something we at Waterbridge Ventures have always been very excited by. Is like, how do you use tech to kind of overcome these kind of problems? And Mohit, I want to pick on something that you just mentioned, right? You kind of went through this amazing journey with Carwale, and then I think if you go back in the day, I guess the sale of Red Bus happened, and then most people didn't anticipate there'd be another big story out of buses, and nothing really emerged out of there, right? So kind of going back to something as operationally heavy, and you kind of touched on this already, but buses is kind of running and operating buses on a ground level is very operationally heavy. So what have been some of the insights, and maybe tech is part of that solution, but what have been the insights that you've kind of learned along the way as you've kind of built this story out?
Yeah, so we already saw last time, we saw fragmented operators, only one or two buses. And on one side is this, right? And the other side, you see, the consumer experience is completely broken. People are waiting at the bus stop without a clue what time the bus will come. If the bus service get ever cancelled or disrupted, there's no alerts around it. And you just not know, You can't get out of the bus stop to go and buy a vada pav or a chai for you, right? You may miss the bus, right? And the next may come in 30 minutes. It's like, it's that bad, right? And so that's one part of the story. The other is operators are so small. They neither have the mind share nor the resources to improve the consumer experience. As a result of this, there are a couple of things that happen. Number one is, typically a bus can make 15,000 rupees a day. But given all this poor, consumer experience, fragmentation, etc., a bus will make not more than 7,000 rupees a day. And almost only like 20% buses in this country get to the potential of, earning per day. So we saw this, big market. And this is the case, this is a category with zero tech and zero efficiency. And we were like, what if the buses are reliable? What if the consumer can really know what time the bus will come? If they can rely on the buses, right? And therefore, what tech can really solve that? And we all have to be solved by tech, right? We all know all these large markets, large problems to be solved by tech. Can you tell the consumer on their phone where exactly the bus is? Can you help them, buy a ticket or a monthly pass, on their phone or using a card? Can operator have an operating system to manage buses better and do the scheduling and the planning and on the book, right? And that's exactly what we built, right? So like a huge tech lever to say this. Coming to Red Bus, Funny is a very good friend. We had common investors, and he's an investor in Chalo as well. But Red Bus was literally catering to the contract carrier, long distance intercity buses, all reserved ticketing. Buses we are talking about are intra-city or a short distance intercity buses with zero reserve ticketing. People can just hop in, hop off these buses, and there's a pilferage and and so on and so forth. This is not what Red Bus was catering to actually. So Red Bus was catering to one part of the market, right? Which to me is great and large, right? But that was one thing to be solved. Go beyond and say, okay, let's solve for this, right? It could be like Flipkart doing, top end of the thing, and you have a grocery, and you have so many more things which can really be built in the whole category. That's what we looked at. And tech is the biggest lever in this, from a digital ticketing. So think about it. Bus is a $20 billion industry that I told you, and literally less than 1% penetration of digitalization. In this country, right, when we are talking about almost everywhere you have a UPI, that doesn't seem to work in the buses because the bus network is intermittent. You can't just scan a QR code so comfortably, and network may not be there. So it has to be solved differently. So we saw, consumer problems, operator problems, zero tech, zero efficiency, and say, how do we solve this in the context? And that makes a perfect case.
Awesome. And there's always this story and a lot of hype around like subways and building the metro system. So what is your take on kind of the right mode?
Wow.
Right? So buses versus the metro. I know.
Yeah. Happy that you asked me.
As a silver bullet, yeah.
Yeah. $20 billion of bus daily commute in the stage buses is 40 times a metro. Typically, a metro, take up a normal city other than Bombay, Delhi, and India not Bombay, Delhi, right? We have so much beyond that. Typically, take a city like a Lucknow or a Jaipur or Indore and Bhopal. Metros are typically constructed for 7 kilometers to 10 kilometers long, which is 3% of the city route length. So if I look at the road length in Bhopal, it's 1,700 kilometers, and metro covers 10 kilometers of that. How does it really solve anything, right? The most part of the city is what we build the metro. In fact, the most of the places that they have metro, they're not doing well because they need feeder buses to feed the metro. Ultimately it comes down to buses. Even in a city like London, the buses literally subsidize the tube. So buses are so much more fundamental. They're more agile as well. You can run a 20-seater bus to a 50-seater bus. You can put 5 buses together and make a small metro, etc. You can do all of that. Buses are the answer. They're the future of the mobility, not the trains. There are enough metros around the world which are loss-making, and they're non-agile. You build a metro. Look at Bombay. You're building metro now. You dug up the whole Bombay because you thought about building it now. By the time you build a metro there, Bombay would have moved to Ulve and some other places, right? And there would be new cities that have come up. But buses you can run from day one. Before we lay the first brick of a house or a factory, we build the roads, right? And you can always run the buses. In fact, they're so agile. And they're literally there from day one. And metro do not solve the large part of the commute. They solve only 2-3%. They might get into 10% of the population, but from a roadless perspective, they're really, really small.
Awesome. No, thank you for that. And I do share your enthusiasm for kind of quicker solutions, because if you drive around Bombay, you'll just know like the metro better be worth it after all these months of pain.
Yeah, and metro doesn't exist beyond 5-6 cities, right? It's just not there, right? It's very tiny part of it. Yeah.
Right. Okay. God. Yeah, absolutely. So Anand, I'm going to ask you a little bit about tech at Vogo. I was fascinated to read about the keyless scooter exchange and the plethora of kind of patterns that you have going on there. So the shared scooter space is very competitive. So how are you thinking about kind of building a moat, and how is tech playing into that kind of story as competition increases?
So super interesting question, right? Because the market in itself is very early, right? And so what the moats will be is something which is evolving over a period of time. I think it first starts with what the customer is actually looking at, right? From a customer perspective, he's looking at getting a scooter within a 5-minute walk. He's looking to get it in perfect condition, have a completely seamless experience, and be able to drop it where he wants, right? That's what the customer wants. And what we need to do is, the person who has a moat is the person who's able to sort of do it at the lowest possible cost structure and have that sort of network in place, which lets him sort of develop that over a period of time, right? So broadly, these two things, right? And where does technology come in and where does operations come in are the two aspects of that. So for us, I think one of the key elements is on the supply side itself, which is the choices that you make around which asset that you deploy, right? Which is, do you deploy a particular gasoline scooter? How much do you customize it for rough commercial kind of usage, whether it's a gasoline or an electric scooter? From a customer experience perspective, how much time does it take the customer to unlock that scooter? How high is the success frequency of something like that working out, right? If it is 95, 99%, versus it takes 10 seconds for you to be able to unlock a vehicle, right? If somebody abandons a vehicle somewhere at a corner of the city, your ability to sort of discover that a vehicle is being abandoned and be able to recover that quickly, right? And your ability to sort of do that in a short period of time. So the choice of vehicle, the quality of the technology that you sort of have in terms of telematics on every vehicle. And the third piece is the choices again you're making on the business model, right? Do you have a pick up anywhere, drop anywhere model, or do you have a model where there's a fixed set of points all across the city, and what are the trade-offs in each of them, right? So to me, these are the operational efficiency and where technology sort of helps you develop that operational efficiency while sort of maximizing in some I would say local maximum of customer experience as well as operational efficiency, right? The ability to sort of do that is where technology sort of comes into play and your business model choices come into play. That's how we sort of played it out over a period of time.
Yeah. But and do you anticipate that this will kind of play out differently in maybe the larger cities versus the smaller cities, or do you think the trends will be similar across kind of people are just as used to convenience versus price, or do those metrics change as you go to the smaller cities versus the larger ones?
Got it. I think so. What we've actually seen, and Mohit can actually add more color because he spent a lot more time in tier 2, tier 3 cities. We're hoping to work together as well. So the tier 1 city problem is more of a density play, right? You are within 5 minutes of a customer. The customer is looking to pick up a vehicle immediately, drop it in the next 15-20 minutes, or use it for a set of errands. Speed is of the essence. How close the vehicle is to him of the essence. The rides are also significantly shorter, right? Whereas if you go to a tier 2, tier 3 city, the availability of transportation options is far more limited, right? Moment you go beyond the top 20-25 cities, the only thing available is maybe something like what Mohit is doing and maybe e-rickshaws, right? And that is where our solution then becomes much more about last mile transportation, the ability to sort of connect to whatever modes of transportation are out there rather than a mail mile solution. Because In larger cities, it's just about longer distances. You're not really playing a public transportation complement game because distances are longer, multimodal becomes much more difficult as well. Whereas in a tier 2, tier 3 city play, the way we sort of see it is that the distances will be shorter. The asset that we sort of use in those kind of solutions will also be a cheaper asset, an asset which need not have the same performance as an asset which is there in the tier 1 city as well. Right?
So the use case completely changes. Got it. Moving, new question for Greg. Kind of moving on to B2B versus B2C. So obviously you've kind of pioneered the self-driving category in India from when you start off in 2013. So now kind of Zoomcar has a massive focus on the B2B side. And would love if you could tell us a bit more about kind of the enterprise toolkit that you've built and how that's played out across different parts of the country and different geographies that you're present in.
Sure. So yeah, the enterprise business for us has been a long time coming. This was kind of the original sort of vision, mission statement of the company was also to really build out sort of mobility tech tools that others could actually end up using. And so it kind of goes a little bit to what Anand was saying in terms of like the keyless entry. So we had kind of pioneered that for cars back in 2014, 15. And I think it's obviously very, very important for all the reasons that also Anand mentioned. But I think that was kind of the beginning of our sort of IoT journey, if you will. And so it kind of started there, and then it evolved into not just about sort of asset security, but then in terms of very, very diligent asset monitoring in terms of vehicle health monitoring, real time, and also in terms of driver scoring. So, we had built out our own custom algorithms sometime back on this and, continued to evolve this. And we've done, over 2.5 billion kilometers since our inception in terms of total travel across the country, really every nook and corner. And, that's given us really, very deep insights in terms of, how people drive cars across various terrains, across various traffic patterns, weather patterns, et cetera. So all of that gets captured to understand the relative speed, understand the acceleration, the braking, the swerving, et cetera. And so all of these parameters get captured. And so I think what we realized early on was that, and this was actually a problem statement that was there, not even just for cars, but also if you think about even for two-wheelers or three-wheelers or trucks or buses. And, a number of players had, approached us, sort of proactively over the last 2 years or so. And, then really during the pandemic is when we started to aggressively build out those capabilities. So during the initial lockdown from like sort of March, really, I guess it was a little bit from February, March onwards is when, from last year, is when we started to kind of go and build this out with more vigor and institutionalize it. So we kind of accelerated our plans a little bit there. And we always looked at this as a great way of also, through the enterprise side, getting into international markets. So really kind of hitching with, existing operators or OEMs or even insurance companies for that matter in these other geographies that are similar to India. Because again, my focus was always, of course, starting in India, but then we always felt that this is really what we were building was an emerging market solution globally, where you have 35 countries that really, 100 plus cities globally, which are outside of India, which are, sort of perfect candidates for these type of solutions. So that was really the broader, problem statement. And I think as we use enterprise, it kind of feeds into our consumer business. So we're in no way diminishing our intensity and efforts on consumer. I think we're as bullish as ever. In fact, more bullish now on consumer coming out of COVID and seeing the recoveries that we have. But I think it's, our enterprise business actually helps feed supply into our consumer business, which is probably, the interesting dynamic that's, somewhat unique to our model.
Awesome. And how would you say that's going to play out in the longer term, like B2B versus B2C? What would you say the ratio of your business will be steady state?
Yeah. It's tough to say, but probably 2/3, 1/3 consumer to enterprise. Obviously, enterprise margin profile is very different. So I'm sure, I mean, you guys obviously, Mohit would understand, that piece probably pretty well. But I think the enterprise layer, of course, you're talking about significantly higher EBITDA margins than consumer. But I think it sort of feeds off each other, and there's certainly strong synergies across the two.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. And And Anand, kind of taking this back on shared scooters and B2B versus B2C, there seems to be kind of a debate. Is it a more B2B opportunity or a B2C opportunity, the way to kind of think about shared scooters? So if you had to pick only one, gun to your head, what would you choose for Vogo?
So I actually don't think of the business that way, right? So we are in an asset business. We are not necessarily in a consumer business or looking to sell to enterprises in any form, right? I have a scooter. I have 10,000 scooters. It's about I can rent it for a minute, or a kilometer, a day, or 30 days, or 60 days, or for a year, right? For me, it is whatever is.
So did I just?
Scenarios, I'm actually indifferent, right? So for now, for example, 20% of our businesses is coming from delivery folk, right? Who are Swiggy, Zomato, Dunzo, a bunch of these guys who are renting from us for 7-day, 15-day, 30-day periods. But I don't work directly with the companies because that's also somewhere where you do get cost pressure from, right? So we work directly with the delivery guys, and we control our price structure. So we get in some sense, we get some of the benefits of being in the B2B2C business without actually the cons of having the cost pressure of having to go down on price on a regular basis because you have dependency on one provider or the other, right? So this is about maximizing utilization versus pricing, and whichever P&L, whichever customer base lets you do that, you sort of balance it out rather than go after one or the other.
Awesome. I think you evaded my gun very well, but good on that. Awesome. So jumping right into kind of the tough moment that we all had, right? COVID has been a rough year for all of us. I think mobility especially. So Mohit, would love to kind of take you to how buses obviously had a very tough time through lockdown. Social distancing was another kind of hurdle to jump over. So how has the business recovered since? And what positive trends have you seen? And why is Chalo a better business post COVID? Just two-part question there.
Yeah, the buses, right, are the most affordable in this country. And when buses came to a halt sometime in March, right, the uphill pages were completely wiped out. We were still running buses for essential services in the cities, etc. But we started seeing a recovery as soon as the cities got unlocked. The people who travel in buses, fortunately or unfortunately, they have to be at their workplaces. They have to go to their shops. They have to go to their schools, and so on and so forth, right? They literally have to physically be there, unlike some of us who can work from home. And the people who travel in buses are not buying their second-hand car or a new bike, right? The price point for the buses is less than 2 rupees per kilometer. Everything else is multiple times expensive, right? I don't know, Anand, whether it's 10 rupees per kilometer for a scooter yet or it's lower, right? But around that number, and buses are so much more cheaper comparatively. And therefore, when the buses came back, we realized that they are so much more fundamental to the economy of the city, and people start taking it up. Today, as we speak, right, on a network level, we see almost a 75% recovery of the category, which to me is huge. I don't think any mobility category would have recovered so much and so much faster, actually. Right? Social distancing has been there. There were restrictions. Unfortunately, if you go to small towns in this country or even beyond metro, you'll realize that people did not really value border as much, right? It's unfortunate, but that's how they were traveling. These are buses are back, the peak hours. In some places where they're unlocked in July, August, and the school college got open, like in Karnataka and some cities, buses are back to 100% of their collection. So we saw like literally full recovery. We may see the caterpillar, lockdown, unlock, etc. That all that will happen. But buses as a stage case buses as a category are COVID proof. That's I think one thing. The second thing we realized with COVID was that there was huge demand. Every operator realized that they wanted safer buses. If one conductor or a driver get infected, the bus will be off for 15 days, right? Nobody could afford that. Consumer wanted safer buses. They wanted the 95% risk of traveling in a bus lies with the cash exchange, the touch point, right? Versus anything else. So everybody wanted safer buses. And regulators, customers, consumers, crew, and they also wanted more efficient buses. They wanted data around how do I schedule my buses? Where do I fly them, etc. And so it was so much more in demand. You would not believe that we signed 3 times more buses on our platform than in the history of Chalo before COVID. So February 2020, I had around about maybe 1,700 buses. The number went to close to 6,000 now, right? Just over that period. And also such a high demand allowed us to be, I'm trying to answer how we are a better business post-COVID, allowed us to do slightly better commercial. But more building a business, you're chasing all those metrics, like number of buses, GTV, etc., etc. Every problem that you encounter, you throw people at that. I will have 25, 30 people for every 100 buses running in a city. Everything I need to do, the more people get hired. You know that the biggest lever for building any tech business is the tech itself. You want to automate every function of that, but we never had the bandwidth. We had the mindset, but never had the bandwidth to do that. But 5 of the lockdown allowed us, to literally relook at the whole thing and say what do we really build. So many functions of running a bus were automated. Today, our cost of running a bus is comes up to 75, 80. We can take a 4 or 5 people and then the bus in one city with 100 to 100 buses. It literally became possible with that. I think that's fantastic. It also allows you to make a business more scalable, cost efficient and so on and so forth. So broadly, that's what it is actually. So COVID-proof category, recovery of 75-80%. And I think with the school colleges opening up in June, July, we should be full recovery actually. And I hope the large part of population get vaccinated by then. We don't have to worry about anything else then. And Chalo is a better business with that. And I'm now trying to work with Anand, hopefully with maybe I don't know with Greg someday. You say, can we also connect a bus with the last mile and the first mile? Can we literally have a customer get out of the house, take a e-rickshaw or a vehicle or a scooter and come to the bus stop, right? And then take the bus. Literally do end-to-end customer.
Super. No, that's awesome to hear about recovery and how the business has kind of recovered so quickly. So Greg, would love to kind of ask you the same question. What has the Zoomcar experience been post-COVID, and what are the new shoots that you've been seeing?
Sure. So it was interesting because obviously there were, lockdowns on and off up until the beginning of August for our business. So, particularly since, we had historically, if you look at it, about, 40% of our business ends up going outstation. So that was something which was, very consistent, I would say, historically over the last 4 or 5 years. Obviously, that business, it was immediately impacted because there were a lot of restrictions in terms of inter-district movement, interstate movement. I think we can all remember that it was obviously very challenging to do that. In August, we were able to kind of resume operations on the consumer side in a more consistent cadence. We were actually, before that, we were doing a lot of essential delivery, and we were actually using our vehicles for a lot of these big e-commerce deliveries. So we were working with players like Amazon, Flipkart, and others. So that was actually an interesting, I would say, deviation a little bit. I mean, that was not certainly the intent of our business model. That was more of a near-term COVID fix, just because we were not able to run the normal business based on the restriction. But from August onwards, the restrictions were lifted. And I think what we saw was something very interesting. So for one, we saw an overwhelming shift towards in-city use cases. So the 40% went to 10% in terms of the outstation mix. So the only outstation use case, in fact, was kind of going back to one's native. So traveling back to some person's village or other city, and then a lot of it was actually one way. So it was intercity one way in many cases. But then in many cases people were taking 7 days, 10 days, 15-day bookings to use the vehicle to go back and down and back. So that use case sort of evolved, and that use case is actually still there today, actually. So now with the second wave, hopefully it gets under control soon. But I think we're seeing that use case proliferate, and it's been very strong. The 90% in-city use case that we're seeing, it's actually a significant uptick in people using it for errands and for sort of personal work. That obviously, since people are no longer really, a lot of offices are still not open, so commuting in the traditional context is not really there. So a lot of people are using the vehicles for various personal needs, et cetera. Like we've seen a huge sort of like medical use case come in, where people are taking vehicles to go to hospitals for appointments and sort of specific health related events. And that had always been present, but I'd say doubling down, tripling down, becoming much more present. And I think now, I think as the lockdowns have gotten over, I think there was a pent up desire to kind of have these family events, and then marriages are obviously always a big thing in India. But I think that's something which we've seen a huge uptick. So the broader wedding season this year was probably about 2x what we had seen in earlier years in terms of demand. So, that certainly was something which carried ahead. And then, more recently, over the last 3 months, we've actually started to see just a massive amount of travel to beaches and to hill stations. And so I think that, people are just, I think, fed up with everything, and so wanting to get out. Now, international, I think the one really major tailwind for us is that international travel remains curtailed, right? International flights are still way, way down. Really, no one is traveling abroad unless they absolutely have to. So you're finding that people are now opting to travel, who otherwise would have been traveling maybe internationally, are traveling domestically, and so we're seeing a lot of spillover there into our market. So we're seeing for instance, travel to Goa and Kerala all-time high, travel to Kashmir and Uttarakhand and HP all-time high, travel to the Northeast all-time high. So we're seeing just massive amounts of travel. For some of it's for staycations, because people are still working remotely largely, but then some of it's just like to get out with their families. So I think that we expect that tailwind to be there, definitely through the end of the year, because we don't anticipate any recovery in international flights until 2022. That's for sure. Because I think given the state of vaccinations globally, it's going to take at least until the October quarter before you start to see meaningful penetration, where people will, and then even there you'll have some gestation, some period where people will just psychologically need to kind of get back into that rhythm. So yeah, I think we see these trends that I outlined as being present for at least another 3 or 4 quarters, and then on top of that, obviously that just opens up the market even further.
Awesome. And I think just one thought that came in was, the medical use case and the different ways that people are using it throughout lockdown. I think it's huge testament to the way you're like sanitizing between uses, and it shows like all that customer faith in your ability to bring the brand and kind of attest to that. So congratulations on that. Anand, just a question on the COVID impact and how that's kind of affected, or if it has at all affected your kind of positioning to the market. So has it changed in any way in terms of kind of positioning shared scooters and saying, look, this is something that you can have on your own, or has it kind of, is it the same as it was before, pre and post COVID?
Yeah. I think some of the rethink for us was about how we actually thought of the business ourselves, right? Are we in the business of just taking people immediately from point A to point B, or that is from the customer side? But there are enough use cases, right? There are use cases where, like the errands use case, where somebody wants to use it for the next 6 hours, for the next 12 hours. There are use cases for a day and 2 days and so on and so forth. I think our thought process changed from saying that we will be in the business of, instead of a cab and an auto, use this for a per kilometer per minute basis, to we are in the business of maximizing the utilization of the asset base that we essentially have, right? And hence we started offering a portfolio right from that 1 kilometer, 1 minute to a 60-day kind of portfolio, right? And we found a sweet spot where customers, especially in the last 1 year, have been looking at products which are 6 hours, 12 hours, and 1 day, where they essentially want to keep the vehicle with them and not share it with multiple people during that day, right? That is to some extent a part of it is due to COVID. And to a large extent, it was a use case that we were not capturing because that was a product portfolio which nobody in the category was actually offering or even doesn't offer even today, right? And I think that's where we sort of discovered our route to recovery. We looked at who is going out at this point in time, right? What is the use case they have and what's the product that they need, right? And we started to offer a product portfolio which sort of met their needs. For example, we have a product called Flexi Keep, where somebody can actually take it. You're going to go to office 2 days a week or 3 days a week. You can book it for Monday, Wednesday, Friday in advance, and the vehicle will be blocked for you for those 3 days, right? So that is a use case which we built here specifically because we do see that there is some sort of a hybrid model which has emerged and which will continue to emerge, right? So in my mind, sort of re-looking at the product portfolio is something that we did. We looked at the customer base, and I think this is very different for each segment, right? Because there is an inter and intra-city segment in a car setup. The tier 1 versus tier 2 setup is also very different. So what you see with the Chalo, where people are using public transport in a huge way, is not necessarily true of the 2 cities we are present in, which is Bangalore and Hyderabad. So in the 2 cities we are present in, the best thing would be for somebody to use their own vehicle if they have one, or use something like a Zoomcar or a Vogo, right? Depending on the cost and the use case and what you actually want to do there. So that we actually saw reflect in a big way, right? Whether you're white collar or blue collar or your old economy and new economy also reflects in how much your recovery is it and who's your customer base is at that point in time. So we actually saw Hyderabad come back to full recovery back in October. And then we use the opportunity to actually increase our prices and our utilization and optimize our network. We've reached a point where we are profitable, including our asset costs in that city. Bangalore is at close to 80% of where it was pre-COVID. And net as a company, we are now making more on fuel and discounts. After taking our fuel and discount or direct cost out of the picture, we are making more than we did pre-COVID, right? So I think that reflects what Mohit was also saying. You can look at GMV and GTV or GBV or multiple metrics which talk about the volume at which you're doing, but at the end of the day, you're running a PNL, right? So at a gross level, we are actually now making more than we did pre-COVID because of the way we started thinking about the business very differently from an year and a half back, right? We've actually now seeing latent demand, the pent-up demand actually show up in Hyderabad. We are adding 1,000 vehicles. We've actually added a few hundred already, where we are seeing more demand in one of the cities because again, it's a use case dependent setup, right? We are seeing that use case actually prop up well, where we have almost like a couple of thousand of more scooters that we can actually add on an immediate basis in one of us.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's so great to hear, right? That across the board, we've come out with leaner businesses, things that are more future-proofed. So I'm just going to quickly switch gears to a little bit more around, mobility game changers and roadblocks that we still have. And just before doing that, I'd love to kind of ask the audience to start, populating in with some questions and answers. The last 15 minutes, would love for you to kind of drop your questions in the Q&A section. Would love to kind of pepper our wonderful panel here with some of your thoughts. But over the next 5 minutes, would love to kind of tackle, mobility roadblocks and game changers. So on the question of roadblocks, Mohit and Greg, I think both of you all have had, Greg, probably earlier in the game, you had more experience kind of working with the government, and Mohit, you work quite often with, local municipalities and governments. So, how has that experience been, and, what are the changes that you've seen, and what needs to happen for us to kind of make, large strides over the medium and longer term? What changes?
Yeah, I think one is it has become much easier to work with the government over years, and we can see that 4 years back, my co-founder Vinayak, right, he's the CEO of Chalo for all those years. He went out and met all these regulators who were responsible for buses, and he would wait, and nobody will really worry about it, right? But I think today it has changed. We have so much more inbound. People are so much more willing to talk to us and listen to us because they realize that entrepreneurs are the ones who are really going to solve this problem. Gone are the days when government will think, I will buy the buses and that's it, right? That happened for early days, BSC and BMTC, etc. And again, these are all institutes, which are sort of loss-making, but they do a great job, serving large cities. But that's not the model, the cities will pursue going forward. And you can literally see that changing everywhere. Bombay also had a lot of private buses. Delhi has done that. So one thing is very clear, that government becomes so much more open for all these entrepreneurial ideas and for the public-private partnerships. The recent budget, where they're looking at $2.5 billion, which will like 18,000 crores, and they said clearly that you want to add buses using a private partnership. I think that's one big change, right, and a mindset. Nobody's thinking they can just do it alone. I think the second thing is, a lot of times people are realizing it. I just came to know that Kunal is here on the audience. He should be on the panel actually. He's one of the biggest mobility investors. That the tech, and the business models and the entrepreneurs will precede the law and the policies. And you have many examples, right? Ola, Uber in that category. I do not know about the self-driving car if they're in that category, right? There's a really law around all of these things to begin with earlier, right? And they all came much later on, and it's just fine. And I think people also become a lot more open to these things. It's possible. Now I see Yulu here, and for that matter, Vogo also will have a lot of space given to them by the municipal corporation. They become so much more corporate. So that's one sea change. I think the second thing, I believe, one of the big roadblocks is still that the cost of electric buses is so huge, right? The buses should be costing lesser than diesel buses, I hope, one day, and or at least at par with that. So you can literally go and change that as well. I think it's one big roadblock, in that sense. And maybe government need to see some demand for these kind of buses at 2,000, and maybe then the manufacturer can start really producing better buses at a much cheaper price. Actually, I think that's the other one. Yeah, I don't know if I missed something, but that's probably what comes to mind.
Awesome, Greg. Anything else to add on that? Working with the government?
No, I mean, I think I would echo a lot of the sentiments of Mohit. I mean, I think for us, just a couple of anecdotes. I mean, it was in 2014 when we got our first permit. So for the first year, we were actually leveraging a permit of one of our smaller operating partners, who was a tourism travels guy in Bangalore. And so, there were at that point only 5 such entities across the country that had a self-drive license for personal car mobility. And it was actually almost comical, because you would sit in these offices, for hours and hours, and you would end up meeting some of these regulators. And, at times, I would actually meet the transport ministries, like the commissioners of, the secretaries of the state. And, these are the highest ranking officials within the transport bureaus in the States, right? And these guys wouldn't even know about the act. They would actually pull out a rule book and actually start referencing that in front of me, because they actually just didn't know. And it was pretty remarkable, because they fundamentally just didn't understand the business model, and then what is the use case. They were like so confused about that, and it was not their fault or anything. It was just obviously just never had been done, and so it was just so new and so foreign that way. And then over the years, of course, that evolved, and people became much more mainstream and well understood. And so I think the familiarity with some of the rules also came up the curve. I think the place where there's still scope for improvement, and I would say relaxation, is thinking about I think to one of Anand's points. I mean, it's about utilizing the assets most efficiently, whether they're yours, whether they're others. And I think one impediment that remains is obviously there's no C2C angle to allow consumers to share their cars. That's something that we've been working very closely with the government on. So there's some thoughts around it. Some potential work could be emerging there, but that's something which the government really should be, in our view, institutionalizing that and encouraging that, especially post COVID, especially when you look at a city like Delhi, where the CM has been incredibly, I would say incredibly loud about going electric over the next 3 years, 4 years. I think 2025 is a big milestone. They've said 2030 another milestone. So I think if on one hand the governments are pushing very aggressively, very loudly towards electric, they should also be thinking about how can we use the assets most efficiently to reduce congestion, and that also is going to have obviously a boomerang effect on the environment in terms of reducing the air pollution.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that was going to be my last question before we jump to the Q&A section, which was a question for Anand and Greg, and I think this is about electric as well. I think, Anand, we spoke about your passion for the EV space as well, and your ether and how you love it. So, what do you think, what is the potential, and maybe we'll just keep this one as short as you can, right? So we have enough time for Q&A, but, what do you think from a policy perspective needs to change to make EVs like the standard kind of technology in India over the medium term?
No, I think it's less now about the government and more about the timing of the market and how the private manufacturers and multiple people in the ecosystem come together, because the government has done a lot of stuff over the last year, and all of it sort of coincided literally in the last 12 months, right? Gasoline vehicles have become 10 to 15,000 rupees more expensive on the scooter side, and I'm assuming a lot more on the car side as well, with the move from BS4 to BS6. At the same time, on electric vehicles, I think across form factors, there have been multiple additional subsidies. So multiple states have, in a scooter specifically, have put 10 to 15,000 rupees extra in terms of a discount. The road tax, which is again close to 7,000-8,000, there's an additional sort of price differentiation. For people like us to sort of, from a GST perspective, the GST difference on a gasoline scooter is 28% versus 5% on an electric vehicle, right? Both on a revenue and on your leasing or your purchase side as well, right? So at every level, I think the government has done quite a bit to sort of bridge the difference between a gasoline and electric vehicle. I think the next step is less of us talking to the government about enabling it with additional subsidies, and more about sort of stitching the ecosystem together, right? Is there the right two-wheeler and the right use case for electric in India, which is the replicable use case, which is the right electric vehicle at the right price point that will work in Indian road conditions, right? How is it swapping, charging, or home charging, right? And what are the standards around that? Are the standards to be enforced by the private industry or by the government, right? So I think some of the pieces around the government sort of playing its role in terms of enabling through discounts, through subsidies at a state and a central level, I think a lot of it has happened over the last year. There's also this additional piece around the vehicle and the battery being separated with the ability to sort of sell it separately. So if I were to nitpick, I would say that a really small thing, right? The GST on the battery is 28%, whereas the GST on the vehicle is 5%, right? Bridging that difference, I would say, is one of the things which is more from a standardization perspective rather than a game-changing perspective. So I would say from a putting their thoughts where their wallet is, the government has actually played its part in a big way.
Awesome. Greg, nothing else, or should we just jump into Q&A?
I think that's fine. That's good.
Awesome. Cool. So jumping right into Q&A, I think first question I'm seeing here is from Himanshu, who talks about what is the future of intercity shared cab services in India? And I think this is an open question. So happy to let anyone take it. Intercity shared cab service.
I think there's a lot of future for anything shared, right? Shared mobility. Intercity cab service would be a lot more efficient than your own car for that matter, right? So there's a future for all these things. I think what we really need to solve for is still a great demand and supply match. People are trying doing one-way intercity cab, but I don't think they got the scale yet, right? So I see it as one part of the ecosystem, and yeah, somebody should be able to solve it. There's definitely a future for all these things. Greg can say more about it. Intercity, people can self-drive car, etc., or all of that. But yes.
Yeah, I mean, intercity for us has continues, as I mentioned earlier, that's continuously picked up post-COVID, and so it's historically been about 10% of our business where you've had people going intercity one way between cities. So big common use cases are cities like Mumbai, Pune. If you think about like Pune doesn't really have an international airport, right? So a lot of people would go from Pune to Mumbai International to T2, and yeah, I think that was pretty common. Remains common. I think that'll continue to pick up. Then you have routes like Bangalore, Mysore, Bangalore, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad. Hyderabad, Vijayawada, Delhi, Chandigarh is a big one. Delhi, Jaipur, Delhi, Lucknow in the north. So these routes are all really, really popular routes, and I think it's about as Mohit said, I mean, scale of supply has been the limitation, I would say, and that'll definitely improve in the coming quarters.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I think Kunal has an interesting question here about smaller form factors, comparing 2 and 3 wheelers. So I guess open question on EVs. So which one gives a better ROI? Battery swapping or rapid charging? And given the long-term kind of change in tech costs, adoption, and scale, what would you kind of guess would be the better solution?
Should I take this? Yeah. So I think so. One thing is, I think from a technology perspective, rapid charging is still, and when I say rapid charging, I'm talking about 15-minute kind of rapid charging, is still in an experimental phase. It's not a commercial tech which is out there, right? So it's in that sense, I don't think an apple-to-apple kind of comparison. No, if I were looking at both rapid charging and battery swapping at the same time, it's about who is the infrastructure player and at what cost is he deploying that infrastructure. So clearly, if there is a rapid charging 15-minute kind of setup, if the technology is commercialized, it is the technology which will be cheaper for any kind of customer because, or overall from a TCO perspective, because you're not incurring an additional battery cost. So in a typical swapping network, in either 2-wheeler or 3-wheeler, the cost structure that you would sort of incur would be around 30-40% more batteries than number of vehicles, right? And that network fundamentally creates an additional cost structure on basically 1.4-ish kind of cost structure on the number of batteries, which is the highest cost on the vehicle itself. The reason that most people still go after, I mean, why swapping is sort of emerged as the technology of choice, or why most people think that swapping is the future, is that commercial usage is where electric should happen first, right? Whether it is 3-wheelers, 4-wheelers, or even 2-wheelers, the additional upfront cost only is justified if you run more kilometers. Is the choice between buying a diesel or a petrol car, right? If you buy a diesel car and eventually you drive a few kilometers, it was a bad choice. I did that myself. It actually, given that the commercial use case will emerge first, and swapping is obvious for a commercial use case, because it's a 5-minute kind of immediate take in and take out, it makes sense. If rapid charging does develop as a technology, it obviously does not require any additional upfront cost, so it makes much more sense.
Awesome. Thanks for that. That's very well detailed. Question for Mohit. When are you planning to launch in cities like Delhi and Mumbai, and when can we see you on the big city streets?
Yeah, we're very happy to be here and do that actually. We in fact we run the back end of the BMTC. We have done like AC buses in Bombay. But I think it's just, while I said it's become easier to work with the government, they still have those project integrators, companies, etc., right, who are responsible for laying out certain solutions. But we are working with them to open up the data. We really want them to open the data and say anybody could possibly build, a live tracking or a ticketing, etc. Transport for London has done it beautifully, and they say, they saved some $100 million because a lot of companies could build products around the open data. And I hope that, we get to that stage. And it doesn't take a lot of money, $4-5 million at best to be the default app for this country for live tracking every goddamn bus actually. So we can literally do that. So I don't think it's a challenge. The challenge is, that all the data has to be just opened up, irrespective of, who owns the contract. So I think that's one. I don't know if there's any other question. I couldn't really see where the questions are. But yeah. Yeah, somebody asking, private players giving bus service, improving consumer experience. So, the interesting fact is that the prices are regulated by the government. Whether it's a government bus or a private bus doesn't really matter, and stage carriers daily commute, intra-city or intercity travel, and therefore, everybody's on the same price point broadly, 1.5 rupees per kilometer. I don't think that's the challenge. In fact, 75% of the buses are already run by the private operators. So I think this question is not can they compete. I mean, they're the ones who are really providing the service. They're the ones to really scale up, right? We should be thinking that how do we grow buses in Bombay from 5,000 to 15,000? Will BMTC do that, or the BST do that, or should we really allow private players to run buses and offer better services? Right? Otherwise, you will always have these autos. In a small city like Jabalpur, you have 100 buses and 10,000 autos. Is the city that you want to build up, right? And so many other cities look for that matter. Right? Unless you really open it up and allow private players to run buses everywhere, it will be difficult.
Got it. So question for you, Greg. You raised from both Mahindra and Ford. So, what is the future of mobility in their eyes? Like, are they seeing it through the same lens, or is it kind of two different types of viewpoints and vantage points?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, when you look at a lot of these large organizations, to be honest, there's what you see is different pockets, different sort of oftentimes competing visions. And I think, for instance, like the way Ford has approached India and emerging markets versus how they've approached their more mature markets. I think people don't maybe realize this, but the largest, the best-selling car in the world is the Ford F-150 pickup truck, right? So I think over 50% of Ford's revenue, last time I checked, was coming from the F-150, from the pickup truck. So if you look at the product weightage, so Ford globally is a pickup truck company. And of course, that is really important when thinking about their overall strategy. But if you look at like their mature market strategy, it's all about autonomous and electric, and kind of fashion drafting off of Tesla and some of the other upstarts in the U.S. Now, but in terms of emerging market, it's a little bit different, and I think they're looking at a more portfolio theory approach, where they're also looking at trying to build up across different mobility use cases, and they're thinking about how to play and commute and how to kind of help potentially support various endeavors on that side. They're thinking about not even just using Ford vehicles, but I would say more holistic vehicles in the ecosystem. And so they're trying to kind of on one hand do more on the software side. So they have a pretty sort of, I would say, eclectic business model in terms of how they're looking at emerging markets. And so the vehicle form factor is obviously very different than what they are in the mature markets. So I think that strategy is continuing to evolve. But then, for something like Mahindra, I think it's a little clearer just because they're an Indian domestic player. This is overwhelming majority of their car business. I mean, tractors obviously does a lot outside of India, but their cars don't do much outside of India. So I think the focus there, I mean, they've really sort of bifurcated with Mahindra Electric, and electric is a very, very big component for them. I think if you look at it and if you kind of read the tea leaves there, I mean, you see that it's a lot about the first and last mile. So they're really emphasizing the electric three-wheeler, so electric rake, electric auto, and the electric LCV, so the small commercial vehicles that are doing first and last mile delivery. And so it's really about, I think, scaling over there first for electric, because the electric car will, I think, be a secondary focus for Mahindra. When you've seen that where obviously the products they initially deployed, like the Verito, and the E2O, those were very, very, very micro niche products because the range was obviously a limitation. The capex to range equation was not really working for those vehicles, and it hasn't really worked for any car per se yet in India. You see the cars that are electric are still way too expensive or still deficient on the range side. But for two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and Mahindra's case, it's obviously three-wheelers and LCVs. That capex to range ratio and looking at that LCV, or the real levelized cost of ownership, that's actually pretty robust today. I think the focus will be to continue to grow and scale that, and then I think as the batteries catch up in terms of dollar per kilowatt hour, ultimately it'll transition on the electric car side over the next 3 years.
Awesome, great answer, and I think that's given us a good kind of perspective into the two perspectives, and I guess the two stages as you may call it as to where they are. So, I know everyone's very busy and we're just about at time. So I know there are a few more questions, but happy to kind of take these, and I see a few emails on this. I will definitely get those kind of answered and sent back. But want to take a moment to say thank you, Mohit, Anand, Greg. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciated the candor and the really enriching conversation today, and thank you so much. And it was a pleasure having you on today.
Thank you so much, Nilesh, for hosting us.
Thanks everyone.
Fun to be here. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks everyone. Thank you, audience. Thanks. Appreciate all the questions. Have a good day.